This is the concept outline review for periods 4 through 5. So what you're going to see is that this is going to span that time period of the New Republic leading up to the antebellum years, and then the consequences of the Civil War and how the country handled that during the Reconstruction. So period 4 is about 1800 to 1848, the New Republic, as well as many of the major issues that are going to set us up for the antebellum years. So the development of the modern democracy. So one of the big issues that I like to push with the kids is the change politically from the natural aristocracy system, which tended to privilege the idea coming out of the Federalists that there were a certain group of elite Americans who, due to their education, due to their land holdings, allowed them to be the voting representatives of America, into the Jacksonian Democrats, who moved away from this land notion into basing voting on citizenship alone. The Whigs then developed a reaction to the centralization of power under Andrew Jackson. So this is where we're going to start to see the development of what will eventually become the two-party system of Democrats and Republicans. And the Supreme Court also becomes the last bastion of Federalist power against the rise of the Democratic Republicans. This is especially going to be important when it comes to John Marshall and his creation of judicial review, or the ability to have the Supreme Court determine if federal and state laws are constitutional. And two big cases that I like to push for the kids off of that are Marbury v. Madison, which establishes federal judiciary review, and Cohens v. Virginia, which establishes state judicial review. This also gets us into the difference between loose and strict construction of the Constitution. Do we read the Constitution literally, or do we read it within context of the time period? There are also new ideologies that pop up at this time period. The most important that I really want to stress with the kids are the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening gave rise to a number of grassroots movements, and they start off in the frontier and then move into the cities. So these include religious movements like the Methodists, temperance movement, Mormons, and radical abolitionists. However, we continue to see a pattern that starts all the way back at the beginning of American history with the fight between religious beliefs and Enlightenment beliefs. And so again, we're going to see during this time period of the rise of Enlightenment beliefs alongside of that of the Second Great Awakening that give rise to a number of reform movements, and after a while kind of intertwine themselves with the religious tradition of America. So for example, the Transcendentalist poets who talk about the need to return to nature in order to find what they call the oversoul. A lot of kids walk away from this thinking this is a part of the Christian tradition in America. It really isn't. This really comes out of the Enlightenment tradition, and in many ways you can make a connection back to the deists. The utopian communities, a lot of the model communities that were created at this time period in which people tried to share everything from wealth even into partnerships. And then the Seneca Falls Convention, which stressed the rights of women based upon the Declaration of Independence. And each one of these, largely what we see are Enlightenment ideas based upon the idea of natural rights, rationality, and equality in society. Another big ideology that's going to prop up at this time period is going to be slave rebellions. The slave rebellions had an impact on both Northern abolitionists and the Southern slave societies. For Northern abolitionists, obviously the big impact of the slave rebellions is that they can use it as propaganda to stress how slavery was so destructive to Africans within the South. For Southern slave societies, they saw the slave rebellions as reasons to strengthen at that point the racial hierarchy, and then to start putting into place the black codes, which would eventually, after the Civil War, become what we're very familiar with segregation within the South. So the big slave rebellions that I like to stress with the kids are the Haitian Rebellion, which I stress as being the only successful black rebellion within the Western Hemisphere, and that created this fear in which Southern slave societies believed that there was a cancer headed towards the South. Then there were a number of rebellions that took place in the South. None of them succeeded. The Gabriel Prosser Rebellion, Denmark Vesey Rebellion, and of course the most important, probably Nat Turner Rebellion. But what I stress with the kids is that even though these didn't have a direct political success, what they did was to reshape the South dramatically. Before these rebellions, Southern slave owners were definitely treated Africans as if they were lesser, but we do have a lot of evidence that oftentimes white slave owners would work out in the fields with African slaves. African slaves were allowed to be taught to read and write, and there was a good deal more freedom within the horrible nature of the slave society in the South. After these rebellions, the black codes came in and set very strict standards for creating a racial hierarchy within the South for fear of these revolutions. And this really gave fuel then to the Northern abolitionists to call for a need to the end of black slavery. So in one way, you can say these black slave rebellions failed. On the other hand, may have actually succeeded by really amping up the fuel against slavery itself. The 1830s are also the time of the beginning of the market economy. So the development of the market economy really takes place because of a number of major revolutions that take place economically, and that's really within transportation. Innovations in technology like steam, telegraph, the railroad, and interchangeable parts also start to fuel the market economy. The big transportation technologies that I like to talk about with the kids are the creation of the steam engines, which led to a number of other creations, including paddle boats that allowed for transportation both up and down the Mississippi River. The Cumberland Highway, which was financed by the federal government and created connections between the states. The Conestoga wagon, which allowed for families to move out west. And regional railroads, which now began to start connecting up a lot of those areas that were just around the Appalachian Mountains out into the East Coast. Cultural interactions. Cultural diffusion occurred in all the different communities. Puritans in the Northeast oftentimes complained of defectors to local Native communities. The Columbian Exchange So the market economy led to major changes in social relationships. People began moving more and more into urban centers, and this created a blurring of gender roles between private and public spheres. For example, the Lowell Mills provided opportunities for young farming women to experience urban life. Now, we know that typically what happened at this time period was girls would go off and they would work for a while in the Lowell Mills, then they would return back home to private occupations in the traditional roles for women under Republican motherhood, and then eventually the cult of domesticity. But what we did start to see was the beginning of the blurring of the lines between women and men. There was a continuity of gender roles. Republican motherhood in many ways challenged gender roles because it allowed for women to train the leaders of the next generation. But Republican motherhood also stressed the need for women to remain in the household. And once we moved into the market economy, this transferred right into the cult of domesticity, in which women's gender roles were seen as basically reproducing the next laborers for the next generation. So in many ways, the cult of domesticity is a product of the Industrial Revolution and really stresses the continuity of the traditional roles for women. However, there is a change to the gender roles as well at this time period. More and more poor women are having to go into labor production, and so there is some challenge that we see to these traditional roles, and we do see that in the Seneca Falls Convention. Another problem that's going to start rising at this time period that we want to stress with the kids is growing regionalism. The expansion of both northern industrialism and southern cotton production created a growing divide between these two sections. The expansion westward of settlers, financed largely by the federal government, allowed at this time period for there to be now a third region to add on. And Eli Whitney's cotton gin and expansion of cotton harvesting is also going to expand this divide. So one of the things I always like to ask to the kids is, when Eli Whitney created the cotton gin, what do you think happened? Was there more of a need for slavery or less? And most of the kids fall into the trap and they'll say, well, less of a need for slaves because we have this new technology. On the one hand, they're right in the sense that there was less of a need for slaves to remove the seeds from the cotton. But there is now more of a need for slaves to harvest cotton because of mass production, which means now that this allows for a larger divide regionally between North and South. The development of the American system expanded connections between the North and the South because it allowed for all of this investment into infrastructure. But the underlying conflict was a growing regionalism between industry, which relied upon free labor, and agriculture, which was under slave labor. Expansion and its effects. So American settlers expanded out for land, and for those in the South, to find land for slavery. This led to conflicts and the removal of Native American groups. Nativists also started to see more immigrants coming into the Northeast, and so they began forming groups because they feared the loss of American culture and national identity. And so I like to talk at this point about German immigrants coming in to escape from the political revolutions in Germany, Irish immigrants coming in because of problems economically. Anti-slavery groups pushed for either gradual or immediate emancipation, and this eventually led into the primary conflict that we're going to see now leading up to the antebellum era, and that is, what do we do with these new coming lands from the Western territories? Now, there's an attempt to solve this in the Compromise of 1820, or the Missouri Compromise, which stressed at the end a way of just dividing up the country by the 3630 parallel. Everything north would be free, everything south would be slave. which leads us then into period 5, 1844 to 1877, which is the antebellum years leading into the Civil War. So manifest destiny is going to play a large role throughout this time period as America begins to expand outwards. The desire for resources, land, and in the time period of the 1840s for slave production led to manifest destiny. America acquires land at that time period due to two major events. One is the Louisiana Purchase from the French, and a second one is the Mexican-American War, which brings in new territories from the Southwest. Now, at the end of this period, I stress with the kids that manifest destiny is going to start leading us into a new type of manifest destiny in which we have interest in the Southeast Pacific, but that comes more in the 1877 period and afterwards. The effects of land expansion. So there's an attraction, like we were talking about before, of migrants from Ireland and Germany, and this led to a nativist movement fearing the loss of American identity. The Mexican-American War brought in new lands, and this is going to lead to a different effect, and that's the representation in the Senate. And I really like to make a big deal about this with the kids for them to see how important this is. You know, when the lands came in, the big question was, how are we going to draw these borders? Because you could draw these borders very small and provide a lot of representatives into the Senate, and whoever gets those representatives will control the Senate. Now, for the North, they want to control the Senate because then they can make moves on getting rid of slavery. If the South can just balance the Senate, or maintain control of the Senate, they can veto any attempts to get rid of slavery and possibly even expand slavery. So the main political fight is really going to be in who controls the Senate. The solution to this problem was to offer popular sovereignty. Let the issue be solved at the local area. It sounded very democratic. It sounded like a way really to maintain states' rights. And so solution was offered as popular sovereignty, including the fugitive slave issue. In response to the fugitive slave issue, though, the northeastern states begin issuing what are called personal liberty laws, in which they say at the state level that they are not willing to participate in returning slaves due to religious resistance. And this is really going to lead to a growing regionalism leading up to the Civil War. So this takes place in about 1852, 1853. And at that time period, you're going to start to see more and more of this divide really solidifying, with the North seeing their need as a religious resistance based upon what they call God's higher law against slavery, and the South seeing the North as acting in a way that violated all of the agreements that they had made on a federal level. So as far as slavery goes, the Northerners wanted slavery abolished, but there was a difference between the Gradualists and the Immediatists. Gradualists believed that slavery should be abolished, to some extent for moral reasons, largely because of the economics of the problem of having slaves work in competition to industry. Immediatists, like William Lloyd Garrison up in Boston, believed that slavery had to be gotten rid of immediately because of the violation of God's higher law. In other words, African people were being treated as objects and not being allowed to do things that would allow them to have their full humanity, and for many religious people to be able to do what would provide salvation, read the Bible. Southerners wanted to keep slavery, but differed upon class-based issues. So poor Southerners feared the growing centralization power of the planter elite. Only about 5% of Southerners could own slaves. It was too costly for them to do so, which always brings up the question in my class, well then why didn't most poor Southerners just rebel against these few Southerners who held on to slaves and could mass produce and outproduce poor Southerners? And the argument we come up with is that poor Southerners saw this as their racial place in the racial hierarchy. It gave them some identity and status because they had some group below them within the society. So the racial hierarchy is going to help support this overall idea of the slave cotton kingdom. Regionalism. The Compromise of 1850 led to an intense conflict over the Fugitive Slave Act, and then the Kansas-Nebraska conflict led to a mini Civil War. Finally, we get to the Dred Scott decision. When the Dred Scott decision took place, there was a primary issue that I want the kids to see that's really important. The Dred Scott issue basically said that in the end, Dred Scott really shouldn't have even brought the case to the Supreme Court because as a slave, he really could not do that. But there was a second decision as well, and the second decision was that Dred Scott slaves, and this is very important, even free Africans, were not truly American and could never be truly American. In fact, Justice Taney, who made his decision, said that all black people, free or slave, were meant to be excluded in this white republic. That eliminated the possibility for any compromise to take place, which meant the Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, Fugitive Slave Act, all compromises leading up till now were null and void. The two-party system briefly collapsed at this time as the Whigs fell out of favoring by the North because they had been willing to compromise, and a new party arose, the Republican Party, with the belief that the Republican Party was going to be an absolutist party based upon an immediate getting rid of slavery. However, if we take a look at their actual platform, that's not what happened. Abraham Lincoln ran on a gradual abolition of slavery. He basically called for what the Whigs had called for as well, which was the idea of having slavery isolated into the South, and gradually over time, the Union would get rid of slavery while maintaining the unity of the Union. The South, though, believed he was a radical abolitionist. So this leads us to the Civil War. Lincoln entered the Civil War in order to reunify the country. However, he changed the war to end slavery after the battles of Antietam and Gettysburg. The North at the time was able to win the war because it mobilized and industrialized a massive military navy. In fact, their industrial navy was able to blockade the South from being able to get resources from outside of the country. The South, on the other hand, did have an advantage. Their advantage was mobilizing a farmers' army and confederacy that believed in the need to defend their honor. The North eventually was going to win based upon the Anaconda strategy and total warfare. So the Anaconda strategy was basically the strategy was to cut off the Mississippi, and by cutting off the Mississippi, the South did not have a navy, so they would not be able to use the coastline to do travel. And while they did have a railroad system, it was far more minor to that of the North since they were not industrial. So once the Mississippi could be cut off, there would be no transportation ability. Slowly the South would be squeezed out. Then the next strategy was total warfare, and that was to go into the southern states and literally just burn the states to the ground, meaning to just destroy the farmland until there was nothing left for the South to be able to build upon. So radical Republicans tried to impose both an end to slavery and an end to racial hierarchy. They did this by establishing 3 major amendments in the Constitution, and I always like to tell the kids how difficult this is. Overall, we really haven't had that many amendments passed to the Constitution, and when you look at them spread out over time, you only get a few in each decade. In this particular case, we have 3 passed dramatically within this time period. 13th Amendment right before the end of the Civil War, which puts an end to slavery. 14th Amendment, which provides for equal protection and for citizenship for African Americans. This, of course, overturning the Dred Scott decision. The 15th Amendment, the right to vote for African Americans. The South reacted by, of course, reestablishing their racial hierarchy through Jim Crow laws. Restrictions on voting, like the grandfather clause, which basically said that an African American had to have had his grandfather vote in order for him to vote. Poll taxes, which made it expensive to vote for African Americans. And on top of that, literacy tests or registration tests, where local white leaders could ask ridiculously difficult questions to keep black people from voting. Plessy versus Ferguson established a national ratification of these types of racial hierarchies by establishing the principle of separate but equal. And then, of course, there was the establishment of the KKK in Tennessee to create so much terror in the South that black people would not want to go out and vote. So my big question to the students is, why did this happen? I mean, if you think about it, radical Republicans were in charge. They had established a military occupation of the South, and the South had lost the Civil War. Why didn't African Americans have greater success? In fact, they did for a while. We know that African Americans held major political offices within the South. We know at this time period that African Americans were going out to vote at this time. So why did things get turned around? One of the arguments I like to give, and it comes from a major historian from Columbia University, Eric Foner, is the idea that sharecropping led to economic and racial indebtedness and made it very difficult for black people to attain and keep political power within the South. And eventually, when the radical Republicans exit from trying to protect black African Americans, this sharecropping indebtedness is going to put them into a position of complete economic and political vulnerability in the South. Finally, in the bargain of 1877, during the election of 1876, the ballots that came back were in question over whether or not a Democrat or Republican would be the next president. So when the issue was settled, as it usually is behind closed doors, there was a compromise made. The Republicans would win the presidency, but the Democrats would get a South freed of military occupation. At the end of this was basically the end of Reconstruction. So what are the takeaways of these 2 periods? For one thing, America is unifying its economic marketplace through investments in land settlement, communication, and transportation. Democracy expanded in its definition from land ownership to citizenship, and this is extremely important. We know that still is very limited in who could vote in America because women were excluded, minorities were excluded, Native Americans were excluded. But this new definition of citizenship, not land ownership, really opens up the possibility for future reform movements to make the argument that democracy should be expansive. The federal government grew in its power through both the expansion of the market and the protection of racial rights.